I guess, first of all, let me welcome you to our Made in Brazil, Made in Amazonia panel that explores the deep history of psychotropics in South American culture, but also very particularly in their current dynamics, both as globalized commodities and as regional economies. We're really proud and delighted to have the participation of the Latin American Center, Iberian Studies Center, and Brazilian Center at the University of Wisconsin. Alberto Vargas, who's its associate director, is going to say a few words, and then I'm going to say a few words by way of introduction to this panel. And then away we go with our brilliant and very fascinating panelists. And Paul is turning his head away, the endless compliments I'm paying. But anyway, so Alberto, why don't you say a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much, Susana. Thank you, Brian. On behalf of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program of our university, it's a pleasure to co-sponsor this webinar in collaboration with the UCLA Latin American Institute and the Center for Brazilian Studies. But I'm also speaking on behalf of the newly created Transdisciplinary Center for Research on Psychoactive Substances at our university. This center just formally constituted 2 years ago in 2021, is housed in the School of Pharmacy, but includes a broad collaboration among several departments with researchers ranging from clinical studies, neuroscience, psychology, public health, to the humanities and social sciences, and also including our libraries. Our center also goes beyond the university, partnering with the larger community, the Madison Psychedelic Society, and the nonprofit arm of the biotech industry, the Usona Institute. And we also aim to establish collaborations with partners and researchers in Latin America. So the Latin American studies, as an area studies, we're looking for emerging issues, and this new field sort of builds wisdom of the pueblos originarios regarding the knowledge and use of psychoactive substances. So we hope that these type of webinars will invite others to learn and participate in discussions that would yield multiple benefits. And even though our center is relatively new, we're very happy and very proud that we have a tradition of research at the university, represented here by Eugenia Fotiu, an alumna of our university, pioneer in these studies 20 years ago. So thank you very much, and I'll pass the floor back to you, Susana.
Thank you, Alberto. And the other thing is that we in California really only have an interest in marijuana, which is one of our bioeconomies that turned into $1 billion industry. One of the reasons I'm also very interested in these questions is, in fact, as a question about Amazonian development, one of the issues is what would a bioeconomy look like? Well, I think what we really are looking at is biopiracy economies. But in any case, if we start to think about the magnitude of the size of these, and also their different ways of organizing societies, organizing trade networks, and so on, we start to see that these are actually extremely valuable supply chains, so to speak, and that given the poverty and marginalization of Amazonian populations, had it been able to hang on to more of its wealth, we would have seen perhaps one of the richest economies in the world. But this is a counter history from what I have in mind here. Anyway, what I was originally interested in had to do with sort of the larger question of current Amazonian development. And this was triggered by some of my own research in the Guaviare, which happened a couple of decades ago, and the creation of a kind of alternative development model within this, within Colombia. Also trips to Pucallpa for example, on other research enterprises, where at the breakfast tables, in addition to what we might call the usual Chinese timber brokers, you also had people coming for ayahuasca tourism. The other thing is that the tourist dynamics in this also have an unusual dimension in places like the appropriate named city in Ecuador, Coca, where you could sign up for a kind of system of tours which involved disaster tourism, looking at the impacts of oil development, and then ecotourism, looking at an imaginary untouched Amazonia, and then, of course, spiritual tourism at the end when you kind of brought all of these together. The point here really is just the complexity of these systems, how widespread they are, and also now how globalized they are. Each of these that we're going to talk about implies a complex ontologies, networks, knowledge systems, varying engagements with the state, with clandestine and other kinds of capital, and varying forms of appropriation and commercialization of these stimulants within global, national, and local politics. So it seemed to me that we should really be taking these questions not as, if you will, ideas from the margin, but rather to see them as being in many ways interesting models, if you will, of bioeconomies, but also very interesting in their own right, and to underline and understand their place, their history, not just as stigmatized activities or popularized activities or criminalized activities, but also as transformative activities, and at which they have all been in their ways. I'm going to start the seminar, the little panel that we're having, and I wish it could be hours long if you want to know the truth, with Paul Gutenberg, who's from Stony Brook, a distinguished professor there in history with a PhD from Oxford and training in Oxford and a PhD from Chicago. He describes himself as a recovering economic historian. If you follow drug economies, his name is everywhere. I'm just currently looking at the Oxford Handbook of Global Drug History. And I'd also like to note that he is the president of the Alcohol and Drug History Society, whose receptions sound like they'd be a lot of fun. Anyway, I'm using one of his books in one of my classes, which is called The Origins of Cocaine, which is about the rise of the cocaine economy and failed development in the Amazonian Andes. So in a certain sense, what we have to start to look at with some of these is their role in the face of other forms of failed economies. He has a range of very interesting books. We'll put those up. We'll post those afterwards. But in his discussion of Andean coca, of course, there are many interesting cameos by people like Sigmund Freud, Pablo Escobar, and others. But he's really interested in the complexity of these social histories and crafting a new history of drugs, which is not the usual one of their demonization, but rather rethinking them both in their socio and cultural terms. So he's been essential in rewriting the history of narcotics in Latin America, more generally, and in economics. So on that note, I hand you over to Paul Gutenberg.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Susanna. Can I ask you to write my general biography someday? That was wonderful.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm such a fan. I can't even tell you.
Well, anyway, thank you. Gracias, obrigado, for inviting me to this event today. Unlike this weird background here that I just put up, I actually don't consider myself to be a Dr. Coca. As a matter of fact, it's an honor to be here among these distinguished specialists on Amazonia and Brazil, indigenous peoples, and these very exciting tropic plants. But what I want to say, however, is that none of these are really my expertise, which has been mainly the history and political economy of the modern global drug cocaine, which of course is linked to coca leaf, erythroxylin coca for the most part, a shrub that originated in Amazonia thousands of years ago. Anyway, so rather than give you the kind of holistic or deep history of coca, what I actually want to focus on the research that was in that book, because that's really about coca's turning point transformation in the mid-20th century into an illicit crop that globalizes from the Amazon to the world as cocaine. And the book was a collaboration written with my brilliant and wonderful Stony Brook ecologist, biologist colleague, Liliana Dabalos, who does know Amazonia quite well. And it was called The Origins of Cocaine, Colonization and Failed Development in the Amazon Andes, which until this point I thought had not been read by a single other human being. I don't know why. It might have been oh, you can't even see it right here. Might have been the terrible cover. Anyway, the book is based on case studies and comparative case studies of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and some meta-analysis by Liliana and I. Mine is kind of quasi-sociological and historical. Hers is much more scientific, multivariate, and a lot of mapping analysis that she's able to do. And basically, we argue that coca's pivotal launch into an illicit global commodity was the unintended consequence of a series of failed Cold War style peasant colonization or agricultural projects of the 1950s and 60s, which is a fairly new or radical thesis in some ways. And one might put it in the context of this seminar, might one say that this was the biggest global blast off ever of an Amazonian psychotropic, yet via the global cocaine trades, which are worth, who knows, $100 billion globally. Anyway, so let me take a few minutes first, though, to put all of this in today's context, which is what is the scope of the global cocaine trades? And it may actually surprise people to learn that here in 2020s, 2023, we're again at the highest peak and widest extent of cocaine's global reach, which just goes to show that the Andean drug war policies of the last 40 or so years have not only been a dismal failure, but have actually been, counterproductive. According to the UN's latest massive cocaine report, which is just out, UNODC, the Amazon Andes output of cocaine is exceeding 2,000 tons. That's a record high. There's a glut of cocaine on global markets, actually, and this is double the estimates of what was available in the early 2000s. But a lot of it, though, I don't want to get into digression, is actually now moving through Brazil, which is something that I wrote a small article about. Approximately 60% is from Colombia, especially from the south, including a lot of Amazonian places like Putumayo and Nariño. 30% is from Peru. It's now mainly from the south, from the Vrem, the Apurimac Valley regions, and the rest, 10%, is from Bolivia, from the Chapare or even other lowland areas. But there, of course, there are always rumors that coca is being cultivated intensively or somehow in the Brazilian Amazon, or today there's a lot of rumors about Venezuela as the next coca capital. In any case, there are hundreds of thousands of cocaleros and their families involved in this trade in various states of social and political exclusion, inclusion, or criminality. There are more than 300,000 hectares cultivated that we know of, mostly in Colombia. That's a doubling of what it was in 2010, just to show you how successful Plan Colombia was. It's likely a much more efficient industry than it's ever been. Everything from the manipulation of the plant itself to the processing and smuggling. So that big historical question for Dabalos and I was, how did coca and cocaleros get to these formerly remote frontier regions and link then to the nascent international traffickers of the middle of the 20th century? And the story, I just want to make this clear, is barely, if at all, related to something we might call traditional or ancient coca usage in either Amazonia or the Andes, nor to colonial style indigenous identity coca circuits, nor even the commercial coca that I previously studied for legal expert that was around in Peru in the early 20th century. Rather, it was almost an entirely new phenomena of the 1950s to 70s. In all three cases, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, the unforeseen result of drawing thousands and thousands of highland peasants suddenly into Amazon Valley zones were by, well, US and IDB supported modernization projects. So what exactly happened? Governments targeted these zones. They were variously called the Yungas in Bolivia, especially the new vast ones of the Chapare regions, the poetic, I always think it's poetic, Ceja de la Montaña in Peru, and especially the upper Huallaga Valley, or just in Colombia, the Oriente or Selva, and mainly in the new departments like Guaviare, Putumayo, and Caqueta. And the idea was to induce internal migration from the highlands to relieve the mounting post-war social and political pressures for redistributive or leftist agrarian reforms, which were, very stringently opposed by national elites in all of these countries. Remember, this is the era of the Cold War, Alliance for Progress, early 60s, and then related in context, big projects like the Carretera Marginal de la Selva, the idea that there would be a linkage of new roads across the whole range of the Andean Ridge. Anyway, for a variety of reasons, yet by the 1970s, all of these core modernization projects or zones were failed or were just abandoned by crisis-ridden Andean states. And what this does is it leaves a significant new pockets of stranded, alienated, we'll call them economically desperate, they could be called refugee peasants in the upper Amazons, hundreds of thousands, and now bereft of agricultural markets or state services at all. And another story, which I don't know, really this is something that should be researched more, is how quickly it is that these peasants learn a new crop, coca. It was completely new to them as farmers. They were all from the highlands, and they learn that it is both ecologically apt and the one crop that has an easy, new, lucrative outlet. And those are these beginning traffickers of the mid-century. Anyway, fast forward, if you can still follow the story, the chronological order of this story, and that is when you get to the late 1970s, all three of these colonization concentrations or regions became the first true epicenters of illicit cocaine, where you would see the intensive growing of coca and the processing of that by peasants into pasta básica de cocaína or PBC. And this is what fuels the rise of the so-called Colombian cartels of the 1980s and 1990s. And this is their social base, tens of thousands of cocaleros, over 300,000 new settlers in the Chapare alone, a new kind of illicit coca cultivation culture never existed before. That was, in my opinion, or our opinion, the direct result of these failed mid-century modern development in the region. And just as a little aside, I mean, one of the things that Liliana was able to do that got her inspired in this is she would take they were German maps of the colonization projects of the Western Andes, and she superimposed them on 1990s maps of where cocaine was most intensely being produced. And there was an exact correspondence on the mapping scales. It's not the same anymore. A lot of things have happened since the 1990s, but this is where it really took off. Anyway, I'm going to close now so you can get back to the more exciting Amazonian psychotropics. But why is this set of findings significant? Well, there's some new facts here. There's some new interpretations of land use patterns in the Amazon, but it also directly challenges the truisms that still dominate wider understandings of the rise of illicit economies, and a number of them that I don't even mention right now. But and we're not just talking about the Amazon Andes, but in other parts of Latin America. And the most striking parallel to what happened in the Amazon Andes is actually all the way across the world in Helmand province in Afghanistan, where failed development in the 1960s and 70s led to that becoming the global capital of opiates production that it is today. Anyway, and that's going back to this. These are the truisms, are these old ideas that generally relate illicit economies to areas or to people, peasants with a deep intrinsic, let's say, isolation from states or modernity or lack of development or absolute poverty or other very specific theories about conflict goods or people called borderlanders. Instead, it's almost the opposite in this case, which is that coca transformed into an illicit coca and then globalized as cocaine. It came out of some of the most commercially developed and state-impacted zones of the Western Amazon, these projects of the 1950s and 60s. And thus it might even have some, kind of policy implications, or at least it's a warning for the NGOs and the United Nations and the Andean governments that still regard almost religiously the idea of development or of intensified state presence as a kind of panacea for chaotic violent drug economies, or as an alternative to our failed drug wars. Anyway, that's all I want to add here today. Thank you again for inviting me. Gracias. Obrigado.
Thank you so much for that stimulating, it's too bad we don't have you for another 3 hours. Our seminars are usually that we teach with are 3 hours. We'd love to hear a total 3 hours on this. And actually 3 hours from all, we should just have a class on this. But thank you so much. And also for its counter narrative to the usual development stories that we get. I'm going to switch now to Seth Garfield, who's a historian of Brazil, and he's taken historically mostly the center period of from the Vargas period really up to the late 20th century. He's worked on indigenous questions, the indigenous struggle at the heart of Brazil, looking at the indigenous politics in Brazil. Perhaps ethnohistory is not everybody's cup of tea or ayahuasca tea, but it was a stunning and revelatory analysis about just how politically active indigenous populations have been. Usually they're sort of in the marginalized Indian thing, the vanishing native, that kind of narrative. Doomed historically, and what you see from Seth's work is the extraordinary engagement in national politics that indigenous people have had, and of course, which they do now even more than then, since there now is a Ministry of Indigenous Affairs headed by Sonia Guajajara, an indigenous woman. his other work on the search for Brazil was also another kind of lost story about rubber in the war period and after, in which all of a sudden you find Amazonia is full of new dealers sitting there trying to structure the economy in order to deal with the problems of the loss of rubber areas during World War II, and the kind of reanimation of another kind of bioeconomy, but trying to configure it in a sort of failed way, as it happens, in light of both the TVA and the New Deal. What's interesting about this is that the model of the TVA, of course, became like the deep secret model of American development politics for river basin development, with being able to show that, well, we had poverty and stuff too, but we changed it all through our techniques. I'd also like to point out that his new book on Guaraná, which is a widely consumed soft drink in Brazil and in Amazonia more generally, which he's going to talk about, just won the honorable mention for in the Lassa Brazil section. His books have won lots of awards, and he's there. You would think there would be more Amazonian historians, but he's one of the few who consistently has worked through the middle part of the 20th century and its extraordinary transformations. So I'm going to turn this over to Seth now.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for that very kind and generous introduction. I wanted to thank the centers at UCLA and Wisconsin, and Susanna, Alberto, and Brian for making this event happen. And it's really a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished scholars. I'm going to be talking about Guaraná, and I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint that goes with this. So you all can see that. Yes? Okay, thank you. So Guaraná has the highest natural caffeine content of any plant, any commercial plant in the world. The yield from its seeds ranges 2 to 5 times higher than that of Arabica coffee beans. It's a plant in the Sapindaceae or the soapberry family. It's native to the Maués region of the lower Amazon, the upper Rio Negro, and the Orinoco Valley of Venezuela. So between the Tapajos and Madeira rivers, on the border between the states of Pará and Amazonas. So my new book traces how a plant that sustained the Satere Maoe peoples, who were the first to domesticate the plant, how this plant came to be the namesake ingredient of a multi-billion-dollar soft drink industry and the delight of Brazil. So although Guaraná's derivatives circulate in 170 countries, mainly in energy drinks, so it's an ingredient, for example, in Rockstar energy drink. In Australia and New Zealand, the energy drink is called V Guaraná. But the plant's commercial cultivation is restricted to Brazil, and the consumption there is also predominant. The namesake soft drink in Brazil accounts for 25% of the national soda market, and it's the Antarctica brand that commands 75% of domestic sales, and Coca-Cola's Coachi Guaraná controlling roughly the remainder. There are many regional Guaraná sodas as well, Guaraná Jesus in Maranhão, Bahia, and in the Amazon, etc. Brazilians nowadays consume nearly 400 million liters of Guaraná Antarctica annually. So it's fair to say that, like soccer, samba, and carnaval, Guaraná is very much a national icon in Brazil, but much less has been written about this commodity. So in tracing over 5 centuries of the history of the social life of Guaraná and its culmination as a mass consumed item, my research aimed not only to fill in this gap, but to use the plant's trajectory to present the reader more broadly with what I called a taste of Brazil, or a taste of Brazilian history. So food practices, as Sidney Mintz noted, are tied to notions of ownership, organization, status, taste, health, and the body. And they're intrinsic to the reproduction and articulation of social orders. Foods evoke strong feelings of what it means to be human, and that's all the reason why that people use them to communicate messages about race, ethnicity, gender, religion, nationality, and other forms of group membership. So let's start from the beginning. The Sataremawe of the lower Amazon region are Tupi-speaking people. They first domesticated the plant in the pre-Columbian era, and Guaraná features very centrally in their cosmological beliefs, their dietary and therapeutic practices, their social interactions, and their commercial livelihoods. In their creation story, the Sataremawe recount how their ancestors transformed Guaraná from one of the Amazon's many botanical creepers to a cultivated bush. And this myth centers around the planting of the eye of a slain child, which is featured here on this postage stamp from 2012, commemorating the myth, which is very well known among Brazil school children because these myths are taught as part of primary school education, et cetera, in which a young boy is murdered by his uncles. His mother dismembers his body, plants the two eyeballs, and from one of the eyeballs comes the Guaraná plant, and by extension, the Sataremawe people, the Sataremawe refer to themselves as the children of Guaraná. The Sataremawe hold a very highly credible claim as protagonists in the plant's domestication because Guaraná, for example, does not figure in the myths of the Munduruku or other indigenous groups in the region. And it was indigenous technologies that would turn these caffeine-rich seeds into a foodstuff whose consumption as a beverage sustained distinctive ways of being and doing for the Sataremawe people. As they say, it's not just a fruit for us, it's a sacred plant, it's like a god for us, it has spiritual power. So my main line of investigation explores how an indigenous plant came to be resignified by new networks of exchange, classification, and accumulation in the context of state expansionism, scientific experimentation, and capitalist development. This is an arc that I trace over 5 centuries, basically. And the book's primary focus is on the interventions of different elite or dominant actors, clerics and traders, scientists, marketers, but also consumers, obviously, that imparted new behaviors and taste and popularized new forms and uses of the stimulant. So I'm basically interested in tracing the knowledge production and the circulation of Guaraná, from a pre-Columbian indigenous cultivar to a colonial era missionizing concern, from an object of Western scientific study. This is Karl von Marsch, the Bavarian naturalist who travels to the Amazon in the 19th century and writes about Guaraná and gives it one of its scientific names, actually. From there to an Anglo-American pharmaceutical novelty. In fact, the University of Wisconsin's Pharmacy Archives was very useful for me in finding information about that earlier and very, from my perspective, very unknown history of Guaraná's popularization during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second line of inquiry, and then how it becomes a mass-consumed soft drink. Secondary line of inquiry, which I won't speak about as much today or in this presentation, was about how the Guaraná's relevance to Sataremawe cultural survival. So not only the traditional understandings, as that's commonly understood or defined, but how Guaraná is as a trade good enables indigenous peoples to acquire Western goods and the symbolic power that's attached to it. So in today's talk, I'm attempting to subject the belief systems, the socioeconomic structures, and the technoscience of modern Brazilian populations to the core cultural analysis that are traditionally reserved for indigenous societies. This is the concept of symmetrical anthropology as advocated by Bruno Latour, which questions these so-called conceptual divides between nature and society, objects and humans, things and signs that are said to distinguish modern from pre-modern societies. So in other words, aside from the indigenous myths that I briefly recounted for you about the origin of Guaraná, I'm interested in exploring the ways in which the plant and the beverage serve the myth makers of Brazilian nationalism and the ascription and the performance of racialized and gendered identities in the dominant societies. So for example, the notion of Guaraná being this quintessential, authentic Brazilian taste, which is constantly being spotlighted in advertisements is key to the way the product has always been marketed. Or the ways in which, going back to the 1920s, as the product was heavily targeted towards women and children, consumption of Guaraná was equated with the modern woman. And not only that, but her dreams and her ambitions of, consuming the ambrosia of the gods. Or the way in which in the 1940s, the advertisements told drinkers in urban centers in Brazil, which is where this is mainly being consumed, that they could acquire the vitality of an Indian if they consume this beverage. Or more contemporary advertisements that, notwithstanding the fact this product is mass marketed to millions of people and is quite standardized in that way, that you can be very original if you drink it, because this is a Brazilian, quote, original. Or that if, this is an ad from the 1970s, that if you drink Guaraná, you're going to imbibe the essence of the savage and let free everything that the Amazon and Amazonian nature purportedly represents. Or that you'll, notwithstanding the fact this is a highly caloric liquid candy, essentially, that you're going to have a svelte and very athletic body to as a result of consuming this product. So let's go now to more closely look at this transformation. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the commercial market of Guaraná was largely concentrated in the central western state of Mato Grosso. That was the principal export market from the state of Amazonas, basically, due to the historic trade routes that link these regions. And this object on the right, that is a smoked Guaraná stick. That was the traditional way in which people consume this in the Amazon. It comes to be produced pretty quickly by non-indigenous populations as well of the Amazon, but this is how they knew Guaraná, if you will. And the object on the left is the tongue of the pirarucu fish, which was used to rasp the stick. Also, like a metal file was also used in Mato Grosso, where it was this product was very much valued. Outside of the Amazon and Central Western region, Guaraná was better known as a medical product, as an ingredient in patent medicines that would relieve anemia, neurasthenia, and all these other, it was a tonic, right, that would give people strength and energy. As carbonated beverages, sodas were products of the Industrial Revolution, and they were relative latecomers to Brazilian tables. Linked to the coffee export boom, the expansion of railroads and power stations, immigration, urbanization, Brazil's early industrial wave centered on non-durable consumer goods, beverages, foods, to satisfy the demand for cheaper commodities. So it's in this context that the Brazilian beverage industry developed methods to leach Guaraná's mix of caffeine, theobromine, tannins directly from its dried seeds, and they bypassed that very labor-intensive process. Guaraná was very expensive, right, because it was very much in demand and it was long transportation routes to get it to its markets. So they develop a way to basically crush the seeds and extract the essence, if you will, for the beverage. And of course, they modify the taste of Guaraná fundamentally through carbonation, sweeteners, fragrance, additives. They reinvent the sensory experience of Guaraná. And in this sense, as historians of food have pointed out, they replicate a historical pattern of elite assimilation of humbler foods through modification. So not going to focus so much on the, sort of the food science that's involved here, but rather the question that Sidney Mintz asked, which was, the mass consumption of any food depends on eaters, drinkers who are willing to ingest this food. And it begs the larger question is, how do people come to know the food, including processed foods and brands? And by what means do those who make and sell food influence consumption patterns? So I've already shared some of those images, but I wanted to go back a little bit further in history to the late 19th century and early 20th century and introduce you to a key figure in this story, and that's Luis Pereira Barreto, a physician, a positivist, an inventor, agricultural scientist, a journalist, who is credited with devising the process of extracting Guaraná syrup for use in the soft drink industry in 1908 or 09. In the early 20th century. So what I'm proposing is that through reconstruction of his biography and his cultural milieu, the broader scientific, social, political, and commercial worlds that gave rise to this industrial beverage can emerge. So profit motives aside, Pereira Barreto's investment in the industrial application of Guaraná reflected his commitment to the expansion of medical, agricultural, and manufacturing science in Brazil. While he was in Europe, studying medicine, he converted to positivism, and Auguste Comte's religion of humanity upheld a hierarchical paradigm in which the human spirit would pass successively through three states: theological, metaphysical, and positivist. So in Pereira Barreto's mind, Brazilians were trapped in the metaphysical stage, and they required technical and scientific instruction to achieve the grand industrial evolution of modern nations. So for Pereira Barreto, applied science to promote agricultural modernization and import substitution represented Brazil's freedom charter. So he writes about how he plants grapes that he imports from France, and he defies some of the pessimistic ideas about Brazil's capacity to have a wine industry, and that he was instrumental in developing the lager beer industry because he convinced Antarctica to convert its ice-making machines from a failed meat factory into a brewery, and that the beer industry does take off in Brazil by the 1910s, 20s with dozens of breweries. It's $1 million industry. And he boasts, these are his words, that from impotent and dependent on the foreigner, we became powerful and emancipated from all foreign tutelage, unquote. So his experimentation with Guaraná reflected this positive physician's broader commitment to scientific and technological modernization. And his successful extraction of the syrup would inspire Antarctica to undertake the development of the Guaraná flavored soft drink in 1909, although it would take more than a decade for it to calibrate the astringency, aroma, and coloration that would prove, the secret to the product. The question is, how would this beverage be promoted and popularized? They were popularized and promoted and consumed within Brazil's existing drink culture. So Pereira Barreto and other Brazilian physicians lauded the beverage as alternatives to alcohol. So Brazil never had a temperance movement or prohibition movement that rivaled that of the United States and Europe, but it did have anti-alcohol leagues that crusaded against alcohol. There were bills that were proposed to triple taxes on wine, cachaça, and beer. And this stigmatization of alcohol, as historian Henrique Carneiro points out, it owes to the increased intervention of medical authorities, social scientists, and state and religious officials in the private realm, seeking to promote values of hard work and hygiene for this new industrial order. They were heavily influenced by eugenic and racist beliefs. And these reformers blamed alcohol use for the physical and mental degeneration, physical and mental degeneration of the national stock. And Black and indigenous populations bore the brunt of these so-called anti-vice campaigns. So Pereira Barreto, for example, lauded Sao Paulo's residents who had instinctively swapped alcohol for coffee, tea, mate, and guaraná, quote, beverages that were more or less tonic and intellectualizing insiders of cerebral energy. So I also look in my work at how these beverages were targeted towards women and children. For women, there was the ongoing sort of stigma of alcohol consumption. And so this offered a means for socialization and greater entry into the public sphere, commercialized culture. But I won't talk about that for the remainder of this talk. I just don't want to on how this is then propagandized, if you will. So his Pereira Barreto's vetting of the therapeutic value of Guaraná was published in the Jornal de Santos in 1905, and his endorsement and that of other Brazilian physicians of Guaraná soda as a medium for energy and physical rejuvenation was critical to the soft drink's early marketing. And what's interesting here about this label, I think, is not only the fact that the attribution of these so-called therapeutic benefits to the drink, so the more scientific endorsement, but also how the soda company is smuggling in, the exotic, the image of the so-called indigenous woman, because this is a fantasy of an indigenous woman, obviously, in this representation, and all of those associations with Brazil's historical iconography of indigenous peoples and exoticization of those and sexualization of those groups. So, in closing, I wanted to just make some comparative points here about Guaraná and how we can understand this history. In many ways, it's another chapter. Guaraná is another chapter in the trade of soft drinks that shaped the modern world. So other facets of this history, this global history, are much better known. During the 18th century, as Europe's population increased by more than 50%, the consumption of tobacco, of coffee, of tea, of chocolate skyrocketed. European demand for these stimulants fueled the transatlantic slave trade, the New World plantation complex, state expansion, colonial rule, transformation of the natural environment. So the massification of Guaraná in Brazil bears similarities to these histories, I would say. Guaraná, as with Guaraná, early modern physicians' certification eased the consumer use of these stimulants, but they too had their medical detractors, as did Guaraná. Like Guaraná, mass consumption of coffee, tea, tobacco, and chocolate relied on complex rearrangements in modes of use and representation. Neither coffee, tea, nor Guaraná were served sweetened in their originating cultures, with the fusion of bitter and sweet becoming a symbol of European cuisine and power. And the exoticization that entailed this process of westernization or nationalization, the native on tobacco wrappings, the Turk's head for coffee house, the indigenous woman on Guaraná labels represented an affirmation of mastery over other cultures and a consumer flight of fancy. But many stimulants that are prevalent in their cultures of origin struggle to gain a foothold in Europe and North America, whether due to cost-related matters of production, distribution, and shelf life, psychoactive effects, or cultural aversion. In the case of Guaraná, historically, this is changing. Smallholder cultivation and processing in the Amazon bedeviled the large-scale enterprise, the control of production and distribution that characterized the more globally extended stimulants. Labor shortages and high transportation expenses, elevated production costs, and supply chains favored consumers in the South American heartland. We could add to this that European and North American affinity for coffee and tea, a sort of dietary conservatism, also worked against the popularization of this stimulant abroad. And even in Brazil, though, due to market disarticulation, Guaraná had thrived largely as a regional beverage, and it was repurposed and nationalized only in the 20th century through soft drink manufacture, distribution, and marketing. So in offering this history of Guaraná, I'm not suggesting that Guaraná made Brazil or that such narratives can tell the story of a nation. I'm actually interested in how Brazilians remade Guaraná into an economically profitable and culturally meaningful good. And in particular, I would argue that Guaraná's ties to everyday meanings of development, which is the pole star Brazilian politics, and for many decades, its historiography. It makes for a particularly revealing historical study because if development is defined reductively as an increase in economic products and services, Guaraná's massification hits the mark. In the early 2000s, according to one author, Brazilians drank more than 17 million bottles of Guaraná daily. And finally, in closing, I would just say that in shifting our sights to an Amazonian plant and an everyday object of mass consumption, we can remember what Anthony Giddens said in his landmark text, The Constitution of Society, in which he defined history as the structuration of events in time and space, the continual interplay of agency and structure, the interconnection of the mundane nature of day-to-day life with institutional forms stretching over immense spans of time and space. Thank you. Obrigado.
Seth, thank you for that fantastic presentation. What I find very interesting about this Guaraná more generally is it is kind of the perfect import substitution industrial commodity in a way, which of course was the dream of much of the post-World War II development, that you would develop your internal markets and your internal supply chains for a new form of development. And also how interesting the whole dynamic of how it's marketed and how it moves in an unusual bioeconomy, one that actually is quite it has become a national and perhaps soon to be international commodity. And speaking of these kinds of questions about national practices and national and indigenous plants with particular and long historical uses, well-rooted and well-documented within indigenous societies. I think Eugenia's Patio's study of ayahuasca also shows how a different model of globalization and non-globalization come into play. Again, these kinds of questions about the meaning of life, the nature of consumption, and the importance historically in human history of stimulants and psychotropics, I think doesn't quite get the, how do we say, the press that it ought to. And so now we turn to a rather different commodity, yet one that also is really important in terms of national politics, in the development of new forms of industry, and also its globalization. So Eugenia, if you would like to come forward here. Oh, I have not given you the information. Eugenia is a cultural anthropologist from the University of Wisconsin. She works on indigenous knowledge systems and how these get appropriated and reimagined as they become globalized. She's a cultural anthropologist. She works in medical anthropology, shamanism, indigenous religions, and the anthropology of consciousness. So, Eugenia, it's all yours now.
Hello, I'm really, it's my pleasure to be part of this panel. I'm going to share my screen as well. Just give me a second. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So I see a lot of parallels actually between my presentation and the other speakers, and I think we're going to have a great discussion. So my research has been on ayahuasca, particularly ayahuasca tourism in the Peruvian Amazon. And for those who don't know, ayahuasca is a mixture of two plants that are indigenous to the Western Amazon. It has been globalized, and I will talk about the different contexts that it's being used today. The two plants are ayahuasca and chacruna. They need to be mixed together to cause a visionary experience, which and the mixture also causes physical purging, which I will talk a little bit about. So here are the two plants. Ayahuasca is a vine, and they use the vine itself and the leaves from the chacruna plant. The way it's prepared is both of these plants are cooked together for several hours, and then they're boiled down, and it's basically a decoction, and it's the end result is a thick bitter liquid. Actually, the name ayahuasca comes from Quechua, and although if you Google it, you will find that most people will say that it means vine of the soul or vine of the dead. Actually, most likely it means bitter vine in Quechua. There are several alkaloids in this, mixture. The one that causes the visionary experience is the dimethyltryptamine, known as DMT, which is illegal globally. It's Schedule 1 in the US, which creates a set of challenges that we can talk about in the discussion. There are other alkaloids involved that are present in the ayahuasca vine itself, and those are the harmines, which need to be present in order to make DMT orally active, right? So if you know anything about DMT, usually it's either smoked or taken intravenously, because it's not effective by itself when taken orally. And this is, again, it's one of those technologies that were developed by indigenous peoples. It's a big mystery. We don't know how it was developed, how they came up with this combination to make DMT orally active. But what I wanted to also point out at this point is that there is a lot of literature, scientific literature coming out about ayahuasca, and usually the focus is the alkaloids. It's the substance, right? And particularly DMT. There was an article that came out recently in a scientific journal that was publicized, and the title of the articles in the media was that ayahuasca, I don't remember the title now, but it was implying that there was a study about ayahuasca and what it does to the brain. And when you actually read the study, it's about intravenous DMT, right? The study was about intravenous DMT. But there is such a mystique around ayahuasca today that it is kind of conflated with DMT. So I wanted to point that out. And it's not the same thing, because in the traditional use involves two plants with a variety of alkaloids involved. And actually, a lot of the times these plants are cooked together, or at least are used side by side with other plants. And one of them is actually tobacco. So plants are entangled in many different ways. Traditionally, ayahuasca was used by some indigenous groups in Western Amazonia. And it had a variety of uses that have kind of are not present in ayahuasca tourism today. In some ethnic groups, it was used in communal rituals where myths were recited, and there was singing and dancing, and basically there were kind of rituals that were culture affirming. It was used in locating game animals, divination, healing, which is its main use today. Sometimes to see faraway places. There is a lot of literature about its importance in native art and cosmology. It was even used in warfare among different groups. And as I mentioned, it was a very, and still is a very important purgative, especially the vine is the one that is causing the purgative effect. And to give you an example, today in the Peruvian Amazon, it is more often referred to as purga, which means the purge, right? And some groups, some indigenous groups actually use just the vine, the Banisteriopsis vine, for its purgative effects. So I have a map here that shows, this is the area, roughly the area of the indigenous use. Obviously now ayahuasca is used globally, as I will say, as I will discuss. My research was around Iquitos, which is today the epicenter of ayahuasca tourism. There is a lot of discourse about ayahuasca having been used for thousands of years, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We don't have a lot of evidence of use going back 4,000 or 5,000 years, as some of the claims you will see. I will talk about what we do know. Most likely, ayahuasca use, at least in its current form, right, what I described, originated around these areas, the Napo and the Putumayo areas. These are tributaries to the Amazon, and they were important for trade even before Europeans arrived. So it makes sense that these practices were developed along these tributaries. And if you look at, for example, the language that is used primarily in ayahuasca rituals, all the important terms are in Quechua, which was the lingua franca in these areas. So that is a really good clue that it probably developed around these areas and then spread out throughout Western Amazonia. As I said, my research was in and around Iquitos, and when I looked at the history of the area, I discovered that Iquitos was very important in different historical times. It developed as it was founded by missionaries, and then became an important port because of its strategic location back then at the beginning of the Amazon River. And it was very important during the rubber boom, because that's where that was the port where rubber was exported globally. And today, tourism, I would argue, brings the most important revenue. Iquitos is still an important port in exporting different goods from the Amazon, but it is also the mecca of ayahuasca tourism. I mentioned the rubber boom because I think if we look at the history of ayahuasca use as we know it today, several scholars have argued that it came out of that period. This was a period of time where indigenous peoples in the area, especially around the Putumayo area, were enslaved and were used to tap rubber trees, and then rubber was exported, as I said. And this created a lot of, this was very traumatizing. This displaced a lot of groups, and it was a terrible period of time. It created a lot of trauma at the same time that it created a lot of wealth for Europeans. And you can see, if you visit Iquitos today, you can see the signs of that wealth in some of the buildings that are decorated with Portuguese tile that were built during that period of time. So the historical argument is that ayahuasca is probably a few hundred years old, at least the way it is used today. And its current form probably came out of this period of time in missions or in these communities where you had populations from different ethnic groups coming together, along with mestizos, people of mixed descent, and there was an exchange of ideas and practices, and obviously there was a need to heal all this trauma that was going on. So I think, together with the linguistic argument, I think it makes sense that ayahuasca use as we know it today is much more recent. The way ayahuasca is used today is in these rituals that happen during the night, and people sit in a circle, and there is a healer that today they're called shamans, which could be its own discussion. Usually the healers sing and take care of the people during the ritual, and there is these rituals usually take at least 4 or 5 hours during the night, as I said. This is a picture from my own field work in one of the contemporary ayahuasca retreats. I want to take us now a little further back before I go back to discussing ayahuasca tourism, just to show the spread of ayahuasca use and its different transformations. There are a number of ayahuasca churches that originated in Brazil. The first one was founded in the beginning of the 20th century in the state of Acre, that's today in Brazil. There are others that were founded later, but all of them combine Christian elements with elements of Amazonian religions. The founder of Santo Daime, the first religion, Raimundo Irineu Serra, was a rubber tapper, actually, of African descent, who studied with Amazonian shamans and brought this, and then he had a vision and created this religion that has now spread globally. Both the churches I have here, Santo Daime and União do Vegetal, they have presence internationally, including the US. And in the US, actually, they have managed to get exemption from the DEA to use ayahuasca without interference from the DEA, because, as I said, DMT is a controlled substance. This is an image from a ritual I attended in Acre a few years ago. This is a very different structure. You have a number of people singing Christian hymns that, according to, they come directly from the spirits, and you have separation by gender. So men are on the one side of the room and women on the other, and there is dancing and collective singing. So this is a very different format. There is a lot of interest in ayahuasca also for its therapeutic potential. This started with the Taquihuasi Center that is located in Tarapoto in Peru. This was created in the 90s by a French doctor who had this idea that ayahuasca can be used to rehabilitate drug addicts. This is a very well-known center, and it was the first one, but there are other attempts and a lot of research going into assessing and utilizing ayahuasca's potential as a therapeutic agent, not just for drug addiction, but a variety of mental health issues, including trauma, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And obviously, as I mentioned, ayahuasca tourism has really exploded, especially in the last 20 years. You can find retreats online. There are hundreds of places just in Peru that offer a variety of services alongside with ayahuasca rituals over the course of several days. And the discourse around these is really interesting. What I found in my research is that, because I was looking at the motivations of Westerners seeking these experiences, and when I started, this was just starting. It was at the beginning of this phenomenon. That I found that people were seeking this for healing, whether psychological or physical healing, and personal transformation. And these two are still at the center of discourse surrounding ayahuasca today. So shamanic, I call this shamanic tourism as opposed to just ayahuasca tourism, because the way it is used today, so when people participate in this type of tourism, they don't just consume ayahuasca, right? It's not just consuming a substance. They participate in this whole system of knowledge that includes a variety of other plants. A lot of them are non-hallucinogenic or psychedelic. And they participate in other practices that are called dietas, where they take these other plants and they learn directly from the plants, which is part of this tradition, right? The idea that plants have personhood and agency, and people learn directly from them. So this has become, I think, so central that it is more appropriate to call this phenomenon shamanic tourism. It was initially part of ecotourism in the 90s. It wasn't until, in the 2000s that you had more specialized ayahuasca retreats that were catering to Westerners. And what I found is that, just like in other places of the world, shamanism is a dynamic phenomenon, and it is able to incorporate all kinds of elements. Actually, if you look at ethnographies of ayahuasca use or shamanism in indigenous groups, intercultural exchange was always part of shamanism, right? Shamans always looked for elements outside of their own culture because they were considered to be powerful and to be more. So they will integrate anything that works for them and anything that is considered to have power. So tourism in itself is not, surprising, I would argue. But of course, what can be argued, and what I have argued in my work, is that there are several problematic aspects, especially because of the inequality between, the local people and the tourists, right? We can talk about this in the discussion, of course. But what I want to emphasize here is that this focus on healing is relatively recent. I mentioned earlier that in indigenous communities, ayahuasca had a lot of uses that have kind of fallen out of use today, especially sorcery, for example, or this use in more violent, this more violent use has. I think that ayahuasca tourism has contributed to the sanitation of Amazonian shamanism, as I call it. But we also need to remember that I think part of this focus on healing is because ayahuasca shamanism, as we know it today, evolved in the context of the rubber boom, and it was structured as a way to heal the consequences of these traumatic events. So another thing I want to mention in regards to indigenous people and how they appear in this today is that you see a lot of visibility, especially there is at least one conference that happens every other year or every 4 years, I don't remember, that is focusing specifically on ayahuasca. And the last couple of meetings have invited indigenous peoples to speak. And you have this, you see that the indigenous peoples have this opportunity to kind of to take the stage and promote their own causes, which usually have to do with land, protecting their resources, and revitalizing their cultures. So I think one unintended consequence of this Western interest, although, you know, you can argue there are many problematic aspects, is that it has offered this forum for indigenous peoples to promote their causes, and it has created visibility. When I first went to the Peruvian Amazon in 20 years ago, basically, when I visited indigenous communities, there was barely any, there were no young people learning to be ayahuasca shamans anymore, right? There was no incentive because this is a difficult path that requires a lot of sacrifice. It wasn't something that was appealing to young people until until we have this interest by Westerners that created this, you know, now people realize that we have something valuable to share that we need to preserve, right? And now when I go back, you see a lot of communities, a lot of young people being interested in training to be shamans, right? And there's a lot of interesting developments because traditionally in many of these groups, especially in Brazil, as far as I know, only men were usually becoming shamans, and now you have cases of women becoming shamans. There's all these new developments that are really, I wouldn't say that they're all negative, but at the same time, there is so much discourse. There's so many parallel discourse about ayahuasca, actually, besides the conferences that are usually interdisciplinary, and you have scientists and anthropologists and historians and people from coming at it from very different perspectives. You have different organizations focusing on scientific applications. There are churches besides the syncretic ayahuasca, the Brazilian churches that I mentioned, that are coming on the scene. One of them is Soul Quest in Florida, which, despite the legal challenges, is still operating as far as I know. It was featured in an episode of a Netflix documentary, which was surprisingly positive in my opinion. And then you have, you know, if you have places like Retreat Guru where you can comparison shop for ayahuasca retreats, among other things. And you have organizations like Chacruna, who is trying to disseminate accurate academic information to the public. So it remains to be seen how all of this will unfold. But there is, yeah, as I said, a lot of parallel discourses and a lot of challenges, especially legal ones. Recently, as far as I know, in Spain and in France, there have been some arrests, and because there's a lot of people traveling and offering these ceremonies, both in the US and Europe and basically everywhere. And there have been some arrests, and there is some discourse developing in Europe about how evil these practices are, and they're used in cults. And basically, there is like a lot of, alongside with the positive press, a lot of negative press as well. So I'm happy to. I know this was quite superficial because of the limited time, but I'm happy to delve into any one of these in the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you, Evgenia. I don't think this was superficial at all. And actually, having worked among rubber tappers, I was quite surprised to see how much and how widely used ayahuasca in fact was. And of course, Acre represents sort of the ground zero within the Brazilian context for the use of ayahuasca. And yet it's widely used also as both as a therapy for drug addiction and so on, as well as for spiritual expansion amongst elites in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. I think that we could start actually. Have we got any questions coming in yet on the chat? I don't know. Or Paul, how about you?
Well, these were both fascinating talks. I don't know about mine, but they raised a lot of questions in my mind that I wanted to ask. If you don't mind, or should
yes, absolutely.
start while they're
Go
warming
ahead.
up. One of the things that I recently read your book, of course, and it's great. But since I saw all these visuals, it occurred to me: have you ever compared the advertising, especially kind of neo-indigenous advertising that was done for Guaraná, to the vast advertising that was done for Vin Mariani, the coca extract drink that took the world by a storm in the late 19th century, which was all about this kind of, strange neo-Incan imagery, which was really to separate coca wines from the idea that Indians as existing Indians were actually primitives. So it was striking, the similarity, even though we're talking about 50 years apart, that area. And Eugenia, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I was fascinated by that. I'd heard about this thesis about the relative historicity of ayahuasca use, and it sounds very convincing to me. I want to ask you, but just two things. Have you ever thought about the parallel between that and there's a really interesting literature on the Native American church, the peyote using church in the United States, which is almost exactly that circumstances, that it wasn't something, peyote use wasn't something indigenous to Native American groups in the United States, were very, very rare, but it spreads up from Mexico in the early part of the 20th century, basically as this kind of, resurrectionist movement, spiritual movement to counterpose the kind of devastating effects that, imperial expansion had on Native American groups in the United States. And it's stuck as something that's now considered to be indigenous, even though we know that it's not. And another just little question, for 25 years or so, I've been teaching a kind of I don't teach it that much, but a history of drugs. And one of the books I used to use, paradoxically, to try to demonstrate drugs that don't become commodified, or why, the question of the why not commodified, which is something that historians have now begun to talk more about. It used to be this book that I'm sure you're familiar with, the Lamb's Wizard of the Upper Amazon, which was like a Don Juan type of fake ethnography of the early 20th century among rubber tappers in the Peruvian Amazon. But somebody told me once that that book is a fake. And I was wondering if you could comment on that it was like, that it had a backstory that is different from the authenticity of the narrator that it did. And I have reason to think that myself, but I'm wondering, since you're a real expert on that, what the story or the debate about that is. Sorry, I just got so excited by these.
Fantastic. Evgenia, do you want to answer those questions?
Should I go first? I thought there was
Sure.
a question. So yeah, there's definitely parallels with the Native American church. I think that's a pretty good observation. There are actually, yeah, as I said, arguments that there were several groups that didn't use ayahuasca originally, and they were introduced to it much later than we think, or than what is argued. And an interesting, more recent development is that there are some Brazilian groups, at least one that I know about, and I'm blanking on the name now of the group, but they are using ayahuasca in a very interesting way that is very similar, I think, to, not being an expert on the Native American church, but they're using ayahuasca in a very similar way to revitalize their culture. So this is a group in the Brazilian lowlands that never used ayahuasca before. And they are now through these networks, actually, even that is very interesting, because I think then the way they got into this practice is through the Camino Rojo, Red Path, which is kind of a in that indigenous movement. Again, I'm not an expert on this. So they are using it to remember their traditions and revitalize them, although they didn't traditionally use it. So it's, yeah, there's definitely a lot of parallels there. The Wizard of the Upper Amazon, I remember this debate vaguely from more than 20 years ago. Yeah, that it is not authentic, but it's been such a long time that I don't remember anything more about it. So I'm sorry, I can't offer more information, but yeah, there was a debate about it.
So Paul, thank you for the comments. I'm not familiar with those ads, so I will take a look. You piqued my curiosity now about how the Mariani product was marketed, using those images of indigenous peoples as romanticized neo-Inca, whatever images. I mean, I would say that for Guaraná, so there's many, I think with, because there are so many myths and fantasies and idealizations that are projected onto indigenous populations, right? That they can make for very strategic marketing practice. So I think there's two issues. Like in Brazil, there are many brands that have indigenous names. So for me, that is an attempt to show the authenticity, like the Brazilianness of that product, the same way elites in the 19th century took indigenous names to show they were no longer, Portuguese. I think abroad, then there's the whole fantasy or romanticization of Native Americans being closer to the earth and healthier, and the idea of Indian medicines in the 19th century, which the marketers, pharmaceutical companies, like in the 19th century in the US, they also play up at times, like the indigenous origins, not so much in visuals, but in the descriptions of the product to show why it's a healthier and authentic and efficacious, medicine. But the people have commented, because when I presented my work, people have commented about the White Rock nymph and how that, there's some resemblance in how this exoticization or the sexualization of this figure is used to market the product, the naturalization, that association of soft drinks with energy, with sex, with sexual appeal, with vitality and naturalness, if you will. So.
We'd like to now go to some of the questions from the audience. So Brian, you wanna read them out here? Let's see who we've got. We could start with Vikram, who works on Guyana in indigenous plant knowledge. He says, I had a very quick question for Dr. Futiu. What is the evidence of the occult or dark shamanistic dimensions of ayahuasca usage? I'm curious about the democratization of these techniques of spiritual and other worldly assault and their potential usage by actors in the region?
Well, my evidence is ethnographic. It's something that comes up a lot. If you spend any time in the region, people talk about brujos, brujeria, which is assault sorcery, I would call it, because basically people will hire a brujo to, if they want to harm someone, and they will pay them and they will say, I want that person harmed, right? For a variety of reasons. It could be, if you ask people, they say that the most common reason for that is envy. There may be conflict or rivalry, but a lot of times envy is, according to the local people, the cause of this. And my theory is that it's, inequality is at the root of this, right? Because you have a lot of people. Actually, Quitos is a place where a lot of migrants from the jungle will go, and they're competing for jobs and limited resources. Historically, there has been a lot of inequality in the area, and I think tourism is also exacerbating this. So you have these conflicts, and I mean, traditionally, this is how instead of direct conflict, right, interpersonal conflict, people will use these methods. And of course, nobody will admit to being a brujo and actually engaging in this practice. So for a long time, I treated this as, something that people say, it's an accusation, that they're accusing their rivals of being brujos. But I have been in ceremonies where they were healing this type of sorcery, which are very fascinating. So according to my, interlocutors, it is something that happens a lot. It is very common.
Wow. From Thais Pasos, is the guarana stimulant effect basically derived from caffeine, or are there other major stimulant components as well?
It's as far as I understand, it's the combination of the different active principles, of caffeine being the main one, but it's not just, so it's the effect, I believe, is somewhat different, but caffeine is the main active principle.
And then Trevor Ritter would like to know, are psychedelic mushrooms used in the Amazon? I'll pipe in and say yes, particularly among the northern Amazonian, the Yanomami use psychedelic mushrooms, but they are more widely used than one might have thought. There's the former director at Kew Gardens did a lot of sort of psychotropic mycology amongst the Amazonian groups. But anyone else who would like to pipe in there on that please do. Evgenia?
Surprisingly, I didn't know about this. I was wondering about it because I don't know of, and I've read a lot of ethnographies. I don't know of indigenous use of psychotropic mushrooms in the Amazon. I know that Terence McKenna and his brother Dennis went to the Amazon looking for and found mushrooms. They do grow abundantly, right? But I don't know of formal indigenous use.
I'm just going to look up the author
Yes,
of this.
I would love to
right
look
now.
this up.
So, yeah. Brian, why don't you ask the next question? I'm only getting the top three there.
Sure. We have a question from one of our own graduate students here at UCLA, Gabriel, for Evgenia specifically. Thank you for the presentation. I wonder if you could tell us more on when the map on indigenous original use of ayahuasca is from. How did it spread far and wide in the basin thereafter? And how do indigenous people in Iquitos view ayahuasca tourism today?
So the map is from a website. There is a, for anyone interested in this, because yeah, ayahuasca history is complex, and I touched upon very little today. There is a website called Ayahuasca Timeline. If you Google Ayahuasca Timeline, you can find what we know so far about the history of ayahuasca and how it spread. The map comes from a different website, though, that I think it's from, surprisingly, from a retreat. It was the best map I could find. I don't remember the URL right now. But as I said in my talk, from what I've read, what is the most convincing theory about how ayahuasca spread is through these missions in the Western Amazon and the communities that were created around the time of the rubber boom. When the rubber boom ended, these practices moved to the cities like Iquitos and Pucallpa. And from there, as I think I did touch upon some of that. And you have, again, a parallel things happening with the churches in Brazil, right? And from there, from Acre, it spread to the urban centers in Brazil. We have something similar in Colombia, where it spread from the Colombian Amazon to the cities. And from there, I think part of how these spread beyond urban centers in Latin America was some literature that came out later in the 20th century. There was a book by William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg who went down to the Amazon to look for ayahuasca. So you have like a pretty good, you can trace how these things became part of Western consciousness. Let me see, was there another part of this question that I forgot to answer? I don't remember.
I'm just going to pop in for a moment here with the thing on the Amazonian mycology is Gillian Prance, who was the director at Q. So he did many expeditions, well-known Amazonian botanist, and particularly interested in these questions, and did some of the earlier collections. Alberto, do you have any questions from or to?
No, not really. I mean, this has been really great 3 presentations. I'm learning a lot of that. I think there are a couple other questions there also.
Yeah, there's come up a lot more. Hang on, let me just check. Okay, Thais. Thais again, who are the guarana plant producers? So that's an interesting question, because of course it has rural development implications, and also references back to Paul's discussion. So let's go with that, Seth.
So yeah, that's an excellent question, Thais. It's a mix. So Guarana Antarctica has guarana plantations near Maués. Guarana is cultivated by largely still by small and middle-sized landowners, although there are larger farms that plantations that are dedicated. And as I mentioned, the guarana that is cultivated by Antarctica in large scale method. It should also be pointed out that most guarana now is grown outside of the Amazon. In the 1970s, you have a lot of investment, scientific research being done to cultivate like hardier, more productive plants. And as part of this heavy investment by the Brazilian Agricultural Agency, Embrapa, in researching and experimenting with guarana, you also in collaboration with private industries like Antarctica, you have the transplantation to other parts of Brazil, so that now most guarana is actually not grown in Amazonas, which is kind of ironic because it's so much associated with a regional identity, being endemic, native to that region. And the other question was about indigenous peoples. Yeah, so in the last chapter of my book, I returned to the and their efforts to retain their distinctive identities and ways of life, notwithstanding or because of these dramatic changes which is overtaking their community. So they actually do market their guarana, but through organic, fair trade, slow food networks. This is a totally different commodity chain targeting largely European audiences. It's much, much more expensive. The emergence of that economy, we could say, is very much linked to the revitalization of Satremawe culture. So an embrace of the traditional forms, traditional types of knowledge, traditional forms of cultivation, a complete repudiation, basically, of the model, not only the financial model of the soda companies, but the philosophy, the cultural model of how guarana is understood and marketed by the dominant institutions and actors.
I have a question from Gabrielle Sutrodowski, who is a student of mine and a PhD student in sociology here. He asks, I'd love to hear more about how the failed rural settlement projects turned into coca plantations, who stayed or moved into the areas, and which networks facilitated the commodity trade. Did this emerge in the interstices of failing bureaucracies?
Oh, I guess that's for me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. There seems there are two aspects to your question. And the first part about the kind of social history, basically, of these migrations. I'd have to say, really, it's a field that needs more real research done on it. I had a graduate student. She's working in Colombia among cocaleros right now. Maria Clara Torres, who wrote a fantastic dissertation exactly about this topic that you're asking the question of. And it would be very hard for me to relay all of the findings, but I can give you the citation for later. But she basically followed these campesinos from a series of projects in various parts of Colombia, mainly in Ariari. And she follows quite closely, and she did a lot of ethnographic work among them. But there were actually been some very classic ethnographies without even knowing at the time that they were doing this, Baronias in Colombia and Sanabria in Bolivia, who look at the migrations down into the valleys without kind of building on the idea of them being the development project era. And that's the new twist of understanding this as modernization development that then goes awry. The second part of your question is more like, well, then how did this articulate with the emerging global cocaine trade at this time? And that's something that I've written about in my earlier books about, who the first networks of traffickers were, where they articulated their kind of sinuous path through the 1940s and 1950s and 60s. And to make a very short talk about it. If you read in Andean cocaine, you would find that outline of who they were and how they found these campesinos eventually. But the surprising thing for most people to learn is that the modern cocaine trades did not start in Colombia at all. They were a product really of repression against a long-term legal cocaine sector that had existed in Peru, basically in the upper Huallaga Valley in Huánuco, and then were pushed out and began to flourish in Bolivia during the Bolivian Revolution itself, and really only hit Colombia in 1973 after the coup in Chile, which had actually a strange, indirect and very Cold War impact on the shape of who the first big narco traffickers would be. But I don't want to take up too much time, but they're very big topics, and actually topics that both really need a lot more archival type research.
There's some questions, a couple of questions again for Eugenia. One is, do you have experience with the implementation of dieta in the ayahuasca community? Maybe you could explain, Eugenia, what we're talking about, and whether that has any therapeutic efficacy with the with ayahuasca.
So the word dieta is used for two different things. So I need to clarify this. One is the diet that people follow before and after they participate in an ayahuasca ritual. So they will refrain from meat and spices and alcohol, sex. This is very close to the diet that healers follow when they train to be shamans. And today, again, there is not a lot of agreement on why this diet is followed. What are the reasons? Like everyone I interviewed had a different theory. Some is most of it is empirical, right? They say that the spirits don't like certain energies, so you have to refrain from sex because they don't like the smell of sex, or alcohol, obviously, and especially pork is a big no because I was told the energy of pork is too dirty. So there is this idea that you need to be physically clean to participate in an ayahuasca ritual. More recently, there have been theories that some of the substances in some of these foods might interact negatively with ayahuasca. So people are looking into that. But the word dieta is also used to describe these periods of time that traditionally shamans would go through as part of their training. And they would follow a very strict diet. No salt is also part of this particular practice. So they eat a very bland diet, maybe just rice and fish, no salt or oil or spices. And for as long as at the beginning of the diet, they will ingest a plant that doesn't need to be psychedelic. So this is a tradition where, as I mentioned before, people learn directly from the plant. So they will ingest them. They will follow this limited diet, and they will spend their time in isolation. By that, I mean, in probably a place in the jungle with no contact with other humans. So the focus is on learning directly from the plants in visions or in dreams, and by observing what it does to their body. So dieta is used for both of these things, right? Traditionally, it was the second practice that I described was used as a knowledge acquisition practice, right? by shamans. It wasn't something necessarily that was done by anyone. Today, it is part of these ayahuasca retreats, and it is used also for therapeutic purposes. I don't know of, there is some interest arising in looking into dieta specifically, but I don't know of any scientific evidence of whether it's actually what the mechanism there is. You're muted.
Yeah, that's because there's a weed whacker going nearby, so I wanted to keep that noise down. A comment from Alberto Rivas, which is a question again for Evgenia. Do you have any comments on the increase of copy vine price and the loss of access to local communities? Are you aware of any initiatives to ensure long-term sustainability?
So there has been a lot of debate about the sustainability of these plants with this enormous interest. I know that tons of ayahuasca are being exported every year from the Amazon, right? In different forms. I haven't seen any evidence as to whether, or convincing evidence that these plants are threatened. And especially chacruna grows very easily and abundantly. I don't think there is any debate about that. The debate is more about the Banisteriopsis vine because it takes years to grow to a thickness that it can be usable. But as far as I know about the ethnobotany of the vine is that the way that it has traditionally been propagated is through cuttings, right? It's very rare. It blooms very rarely, right? So it doesn't propagate so much by seeds as by cuttings. That means it needs human intervention to propagate. So even if you find ayahuasca in the middle of the jungle, it was probably planted there by humans sometime in the past, right? And since I have been going to the Peruvian Amazon, every retreat center that I visited has its own garden where they grow ayahuasca. Obviously, it takes years to grow, but everyone is mindful of that and is trying to grow their own ayahuasca. But of course, because of the demand, there's still people going into the jungle and harvesting and selling it on the market. Unfortunately, I don't know of any consistent or thorough study of that, with numbers, like how much ayahuasca is actually being sold, how much is exported. I don't know about current prices, honestly. But it is something that needs to be done, definitely.
There's a question from Liesl Picard. I have colleagues born and raised in urban areas in Ecuador and Peru who have regularly engaged in various rituals over the last 20 years, but in more private settings. Are these locals visiting ayahuasca retreats alongside foreign tourists? And if so, can you share any interesting developments resulting from those interactions?
Yes, that's a good question. There is definitely urban people from in the rituals I attended when I was doing my research. There were definitely urban Peruvians participating in these rituals. A lot of the people I interviewed were Peruvian. They didn't know much more about ayahuasca than the foreign visitors, unsurprisingly, right? Because they although they live in the same country, they have very little knowledge of indigenous practices, right? So they were not very different in their motivations. They were fascinated by ayahuasca. They had usually some spiritual interests. they did practice things like meditation or spiritualism and read relevant literature. So I would say that their motivations and their trajectories were not very different from foreigners.
Now, I think we'll have one final question, and then we thank our really fantastic panelists and our audience for being so engaged. So Thais Pasos once again says, how sustainable are those guarana plantations? Are they mostly monoculture? Do they get blamed for causing deforestation? I turn it over to Seth.
So I don't have that's an excellent question. I don't have the exact answer to that question. I could say off the bat that it's less sustainable than the traditional agroecological practices, the analog forestry that the Satre Maui people practice. And in fact, those who sell their guarana or market their guarana to the indigenous consortium that then sells it to the companies, the fair trade companies, firms in Europe that market, they have to adhere to these specific standards of cultivation, traditional processing practices in order to gain those certifications. So what's happened in terms of the plants themselves is that Embrapa does extensive research. They were known as clones, the plants, although they were not genetically modified, but they were selectively bred to be more, to yield higher amounts of caffeine, to come to harvest faster. So in other words, to intensify and expedite the harvesting of guarana, which in part was done not only for profit purposes, but to meet legal requirements, because in the 1970s, the Brazilian government passes a law basically that industrial fruit beverages have to have a certain percentage of the fruit that they're claiming in the product, which then places a big onus on these soda manufacturers to ramp up the production of guarana to ensure that they can have that minimum. It's a very small percentage, but yet it has to be met legally to fulfill this requirement. So there are a lot of questions about, that those selectively bred plants, which are distributed not only to the large plantations, but even to smaller smallholders in the Amazon, that they reduce genetic diversity, that they require extensive inputs to ensure productivity, that there are a series of potential problems that are associated with that type of plant and that type of crop. How extensive, that's a hard question because, the main, culprits for deforestation are typically like cattle ranchers and soy producers in the Amazon. So to what extent the larger plantations in the Amazon are contributing, I don't think they're helping it, though. I don't think they are the main culprits given the scale of the other, commodities, basically.
Well, I think we're going to end with that. Thank you so much. Once again, our wonderful panel, Paul Gutenberg, Seth Garfield, Evgenia. I think we had over 60 participants. People were very interested in this, and you could tell that this was the case by the many questions that we had. Once again, thank you so much for giving us your time. And we look forward to more of this. And Alberto, we're coming for you on our next round.
We'll be happy to do this as many as they arise and we can cover. That would be great. Yeah, thank you, Susanna and Brian, for convening.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.